Welcome everyone to Sydney Addiction Seminar for July 2021. We've got a fantastic presentation lined up. We have a fantastic audience. We had the most register that we've ever had. Tonight we're talking about medicinal cannabis in 2021. When, why, and how. We have two speakers, Mark Hardy and Nick Linceris. Two speakers to do when, why, and how. Mark is going to do when and a little bit of why, and Nick Linceris is going to do a little bit of why and a lot of how. So Mark Hardy is an addiction medicine specialist and works in private practice as well. And he has experience with this area, and he's a member of the advisory board of CA clinics. And has a lot of hands-on experience with medicinal cannabis. So I welcome Mark to get us going.
Thanks very much. Thank you so much for that introduction, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. So look, I've actually prepared essentially a large talk and a small talk, but the large talk's broken into two, and they've all got about 14 or 15 slides in them each. And so that allows us essentially a couple of breaks through the talk for Nick to give some perspectives on things. And then it also gives us time where if we're getting to the point where it's a talk soup and we want to just have an open discussion, we can lop off, the last third of the talk, and you won't walk away without having sufficient information to work with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my first screen and see if I can find something to show you, and we'll talk a little bit about cannabis there. I do love technology. It's so much fun, isn't it? Does everyone like technology? We're probably all in the same boat. So that's me, obviously. And that's some of my previous occupations and preoccupations. Obviously, I've been funded to do all sorts of different things. Probably the biggest funder of all would have been New South Wales Health, like it is for most of us. But along the way, I've been funded to do research, education, and advocacy for a variety of other companies. There has been some tied research in there, none of which will affect or alter the information or the opinions that I'm going to give today. So this one is just a mini talk. So we'll talk, you don't need to write all these down, you don't need to write anything down, but this is just sort of like a glazed over summary of some of the stuff that I want to talk about initially, because I think it's most directly relatable to addiction medicine specialists. And it's also something upon which I based a talk that I gave at the Australia-New Zealand Conference in Addiction over the internet via televisual techniques about 2 months ago. So, I mean, look, the basic tenet of this slide is that we've had cannabis since the Stone Age, and it's been found, 10,000 years ago. Some of the names that we've got for cannabis today, such as ganja, are actually from very old words in ancient languages. And there's a nice picture of something very, very old for you to look at. That's Tel Arad in the Kingdom of Judea, or what's left of it. It's been written about as well. And it's been used basically either as an incense type of product, or even as an inhaled or edible product in the Iron Age and later on in ancient Greece as well. It was depicted in that picture down below in botanical art in the Byzantine era, and hashish was described in Islam cultures in the Middle Ages. It's interesting, the Hashishans were actually the basis upon which the word assassin came about, because people would trade in hashish, and if you wanted to...
No, I've tried everything.
Yeah. Thanks. If you wanted to knock someone off, you just get a couple of ounces of hashish, and and away you'd go. You know, someone would sneak up behind the intended target and knock them on the head for you. Now, it's also been interesting to look at sort of modern history. We go through cannabis being used by Napoleon's troops when they invaded Egypt, where they couldn't get alcohol, even though they wanted it, because the Egyptians didn't drink. If we look at some of the psychological effects of cannabis, they're well described in the 1830s and 1840s by doctors. And in fact, it's also found its way into various wonderful pieces of literature. If we go to the first legislation around prohibition, we're looking at the early 20th century with the International Convention on Opium in The Hague, and then finally the marijuana tax in the USA, which eventually led to its prohibition. Now, interesting as that all is, it's relevant to think for a moment, what were the sorts of things people used cannabis for apart from getting stoned all of that time? And there has been lots of interesting data and lots of interesting research done in this. People do whole PhDs on the history and philosophy of various aspects of medicine, and cannabis is no different. What they've come up with over time is things like inflammatory diseases, depression, amenorrhea, arthritis, loss of appetite, and asthma. And at least 3 of those are the sorts of things that we're looking at when we look at medicinal cannabis today. If we look at sort of modern self-medication, I wrote this before I even knew Nick was going to be one of our co-commentators tonight, and so hats off to Nick. He did some really interesting work with his colleagues in the CAM study, and he did a couple of them, and I think there's one more coming, which I'm sure Nick will want to talk about when he gets a chance to talk. It's interesting. What's come out of this is people will spend about $68 a week on cannabis at that time, and about 6/7 of it, I suppose, was inhaled. And the main reasons, not that dissimilar to some of the things that we saw, in ancient times: anxiety, chronic pain, depression, sleep problems. Now, in the CAM study, there was a high level of side effects, which I've listed there. And there were a couple of issues that really came out of this. And the first is that about 1/6 of people at the time met DSM criteria for moderate to severe cannabis use disorder. That needs to be pointed out, that people, when they self-reported using cannabis as in a medicinal context, they certainly didn't just go and do it by halves. They certainly got stuck into it, and about 17.5% of them reported sufficient use and sufficient criteria to meet a use disorder. And of course, there was the other concerns that came out. This is the really good stuff about the qualitative nature of this research, is that it also pointed out that people felt that it should be more mainstream, that the illicit sourcing was problematic, and that it was obviously going to just criminalize their medicalized problems, and that there was an issue with consistency and quality, which we find is something that certainly is different about medicinal cannabis when it's provided by cannabis growers and pharmaceutical companies that deal in the business of manufacturing and selling medicinal cannabis products. And of course, I got interested in this because of this slide, and that was a bit of work that came out of the late 2000s, before 2010, and it's referenced from the MJA. And it was about the same time that this work was being done that I was fortunate enough to be working at Langton Centre with James Bell and then subsequently Nick, and we were looking at educational materials for addiction medicine specialists. And we embarked on a fairly ambitious project to do one on pharmaceutical opioid misuse. And one of the nice things about the Roxburgh paper is that what it showed is the start of 1999-2000 is somewhere around about 3/4 of hospital separations from opioid poisoning were due to heroin, and only about a quarter were due, or sorry, 1/5, sorry, were due to pharmaceuticals. But by the end of the decade, the polls had almost completely flipped on that, and about 3/4 of opioid poisonings were due to pharmaceuticals, and only about a quarter of them were due to illicit opioids. And where did this all come from? Well, it came from prescription pads, and it came from pharmacy cupboards, and it came from people giving their kids opioids for their pain, and sometimes people selling their opioids to other people to earn a living. And this is a big problem because we have an aging population, and so this is just one of the issues around opioid prescribing that's being currently mopped up by the various different things that have been happening over the last 3 or 4 years in medicine in Australia. We're seeing PBS defunding of opioids. We're seeing TGA change guidelines for the use of opioids for chronic non-cancer pain. We've seen a virtual shift of the polls of pain specialists from 20 years ago, where opioids were promoted to get ahead of the pain, to now where people are being deprescribed opioids and essentially being taken off them. But what this leaves, of course, is a large gap of people in the middle who are either now sourcing opioids through various ways they might never have thought they'd do previously, sometimes illicitly, or having to put up with pain and finding that they don't have any ready remedy for this. Further to what I just said, it's not like the opioid deaths have backed off as a consequence of defunding. This was just as the defunding was happening, but certainly long after deprescribing of opioids had already undertaken. And opioids were still of the main. This is of all illicit drugs and how people died. 37% of them were due to opioids. Of course, people didn't just have an opioid in their system when they died. They will most likely have been more likely to die if they had multiple depressant substances in their body at the same time. So this, of course, is in some ways a bit of a mashup of a slide, but this has come from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, and this is how they've broken it down. And of course, one of the most worrying trends about it was the synthetic opioids, things like tramadol, fentanyl, were tending to increase. It's interesting, people don't tend to feel the same drug liking, I suppose, for drugs like tramadol and tapentadol that they might do for drugs like oxycodone, morphine, or heroin. However, it must be said that they all have a tendency to cause dependence, and just because tapentadol has a reported 1/29th the opioid equivalents, according to official papers of morphine, doesn't mean that you can't get hooked on it. I've seen people turn up on 1,000, 1,500 milligrams of tapentadol, and they struggle to get off it. Now, I know this is not directly relatable yet to medicinal cannabis, but it does bring us back to what happens as an addiction medicine specialist when you see someone on opioids or you see someone in pain. Quite often they're forgotten that they may be shooting for something that's impossible. Most of the patients that I see who've come in with very unrealistic goals about pain will come out with unrealistic answers, unfortunately. So we aim for about a 30% or better improvement in pain with improved functional capacity. There's no point in taking pain away if you're stiff as a board, lying on the couch with the remote control, just watching Netflix all day. But if you can actually contribute some meaningful way to a lifestyle or have a quality of life, then the pain reduction is worth having a go for. We obviously want to minimize adverse effects. Some cannabinoids do that. Others obviously have, as we heard in the CAM study, can have some side effects, some considerable side effects, in fact. We want to control aberrant behaviors, and we still want to do that whether we're going to use opioids or we're going to use cannabinoids. And one of the things about chronic pain treatment, which was poorly understood probably 30 years ago, but is all too well understood now, is hyperalgesia. Opioids cause hyperalgesia, so people tend to escalate the doses and then find themselves in more pain. And then they run the risk of overdose. And one of the nice things about using a medicinal cannabinoid is that it's extremely difficult to overdose on a cannabinoid product. And there are lots of, I guess, physical and psychological warning shots fired in the air that'll give you plenty of time to back off on using a cannabinoid, or to use a different type of cannabinoid for that matter. Now, of course, medicinal cannabis has thrown up questions that we might not have thought of 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And the WHO stepladder is an absolute classic, because if we look at it, anything above step 1 really involves opioids. And yet, if we're going to live in a society that's going to defund, deprescribe and deter doctors from prescribing or using opioids, then the WHO stepladder is out the window, or at least parts of it that contain opioids are. And it leads us to think, well, where do we fit something like a cannabinoid in? Should it be at step 3 or step 4, or could we even think about putting it in at step 2? In fact, if we look at Canada, they've introduced guidelines recently that suggest it as a second-line treatment. We're not there yet, and nor are our guidelines, nor am I challenging our guidelines by bringing that up. I'm simply raising a question for us to consider, that potentially we're using cannabinoids as a last resort treatment. And if we see less than perfect results in patients who are using cannabinoids for chronic pain, it's because most of the time, by the time they get to a prescriber, they've had multiple interventions, which may include things like spinal injections or epidural injections, spinal cord stimulators. They've tried half a dozen opioids. They've tried anti-neuropathic drugs. Most of the patients who I see with chronic pain who want medicinal cannabis are not 25-year-olds trying to legitimize cannabis use disorder, although I do see them too. But the average age is about 55, sort of late Gen X, coming into baby boomers who want to maintain a quality of life. So the question is, where should they sit in terms of the WHO stepladder? And the answer is, it's extremely difficult to reconcile the ladder with treatment today with things like cannabinoids or TMS or deep brain stimulation. So if we look at just briefly the sorts of, there are 2 main products in a cannabis plant that are currently utilized, and I'm going to talk about phytocannabinoids primarily. I think Nick can talk a lot about some of the interesting synthetic stuff, which I think we haven't really got to much in Australia yet, but there's been a lot of research overseas on synthetic cannabinoids. But the phytocannabinoids, there's really 2 active ingredients that are used. The first one is cannabidiol, which is abbreviated to CBD. It's fairly low impact, to be honest. It's non-addictive, it's not psychoactive. A recent study demonstrating no significant impact on driving. It tends to work more through pathways of inflammation. It does have some GABA effects. It's anti-inflammatory and analgesic. It certainly, I see, improved pain coping and anxiety, and it's usually helpful with sleep. Doses, I've written doses there, 25 to 100 milligram BD. They're probably really starting doses. I've seen people who need considerably higher doses to get anywhere. And one thing about CBD is that if you use the sorts of doses that are being tossed around now as the S3 indication of 150 milligrams per day, you're going to have a lot of, I guess, people who are going to slip through the cracks, or who are going to actually try this and think, well, medicinal cannabis is useless, because 150 milligrams a day isn't a lot for pain and inflammation. People may need 300, 400, 500 milligrams a day. At the moment in Australia, that is a very expensive enterprise if you are using 300 milligrams a day. Traditionally, most TGA applications for CBD are around about 300 milligrams per day, and you have to then go back to the TGA and get an approval to go higher in doses, but it's not uncommon to have to go back if you want to just use CBD, to find yourself asking the TGA for 500 or 600 milligrams of CBD per day. Now, I've left out some of the indications here about epilepsy, and we can come back around to them a little bit later. But it's interesting. The doses for epilepsy are sky high. If you've got a treatment-resistant epileptic, the doses that you would need to use are almost financially untenable. And even the calculations in America when using CBD of about $32,000 a day are not unrealistic. And if we were to treat epileptics in Australia, it would be very easy to rack up almost the same bill if you were just going to use CBD for treatment-resistant epilepsy. So that's the CBD stuff, and quite often it's a starting point for people with chronic pain, but it's not where all of my patients will end up. And usually when I talk to patients, if I was having a consultation over the internet now with someone in the audience, I'd be saying, we'll start with CBD if you want to preserve your driving. It has some anti-inflammatory properties, it has some analgesic properties, it'll probably help pain coping and sleep a bit. It may help you feel less anxious about your pain. About 2/3 of my patients might feel better on CBD, but a third of my patients will either want an increase in dose or they'll want something stronger. And that's where delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol comes in. So THC, of course, is the psychoactive component of medicinal cannabis, and it is the thing that gets people stoned. We tend to use very, very low doses in medicinal contexts, probably about 1/20th that which you'd smoke in a joint. There is some synergy between CBD and THC, and people write, legions of research papers on what they call the entourage effect, which is the combination of different cannabinoids together, that they actually equal more than the sum of their parts. So the doses we would use with tetrahydrocannabinol are usually around 5 to 20 milligrams, 2 to 3 times a day. And it's quite common to use combination products. In fact, more and more, the longer I work in the cannabis field, the less if I have someone with significant pain, which is sleep interfering, and this pain score is quite high, and they've got that history of trialing things like interventional pain techniques and high doses of opioids. It would be unusual that I wouldn't want to try them on a combination product first. And whilst that needs to be leveraged against the likelihood of impacting on driving, and we can come back to in the Q&A about how long people have to be off cannabis before they can drive. Whilst I'll have to have that conversation with people about driving, that they can't drive while they're actively using a THC product because it's still illegal, even though it's medicinal, that if they wash it out, they can go back to driving. And sometimes people will say, well, I'll have a combination product or I'll have a THC product. And then if I'm going to drive, I'll wash out the THC and I'll try and use some CBD, or I'll go back on my traditional meds then. The other thing is that CBD is quite expensive. So CBD for a 30 ml bottle of 100 milligram per ml, so that's 3,000 milligrams of CBD in a bottle, will cost around about $200 plus postage, or $200 plus dispense fees. And that would be probably one of the cheaper manufactured ones. There are compounders out there who are doing it cheaper, and there are some illicit cannabinoid purveyors in northern New South Wales who can do it cheaper. The purity of that is probably questionable, but it is an expensive enterprise to use CBD. THC, of course, is in abundance in cannabis plants, and quite often when people are trying to purify CBD, they're having to pay for assays, they're having to pay for purity tests, they're having to make sure that it is something people can drive on. But the goalposts are incredibly generous when it comes to THC. So as people transition from CBD to THC products, the prices drop considerably. The price of a THC containing product, say a 20 milligram per mil product, 100 mils of THC with maybe 1 or less milligram of CBD, and it is only about $250. And so there we've got about hundreds of 10,000 milligrams of THC for $250, whereas on the other side of the coin, you had 3,000 milligrams of CBD pure for about $200, $220. And so there is a cost or a health economics argument to be had with patients if you're going to be using THC or CBD products or some combination of the two. And certainly it is as cheap as chips to use THC, and it is highly effective against pain, so long as one's mindful of the potential psychoactive effects and one's taken a pretty good drug and alcohol history and done a risk assessment and a mental health history. Of course, you'd be worried about using anything with THC with anyone who had unstable mental health issues. You would meet considerable resistance from anyone, including myself, if they had a history of psychosis, particularly psychosis on a cannabis plant. You just can't go down that road with THC with people with a past history of psychosis. But it's interesting how many people I see who've had significant diagnoses made by psychiatrists over the years. Some war veterans, for instance, who've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and in fact, they're smoking 3 grams a day and their mood never changes from conversation to conversation. So again, you've got to be thinking about the diagnosis that's been made in some cases by some people. There is potential actually that not everyone who's had a history of psychosis has actually had a psychosis. So you need to go back and do your homework about that. If someone's asking for a THC product with that sort of history, you probably need to do a little bit of research, get some collateral history, and work out where they've come from before striking it out completely. But certainly wouldn't dive in, where angels fear to tread. And look, this is going to be the last slide of, I think, the first little bit, and then we can stop for some conversation from Nick. But I just wanted to really go through the processes. So there's a portal on the TGA. I was going to get a video of this, but having looked at what we have in terms of technology tonight and the fact that it could just take up a lot of time, there are lots of videos on the internet, and the TGA have got videos on this. You just get a portal. You go on the TGA, there's a portal there that you get all SASPs through. And if we look at long-acting injectable buprenorphine and the story there, the portal was available for that. You look at other drugs if you need to use the SASP portal. Oncologists are very familiar with using SASP portals for their drugs. You set it up with the username, which is usually your email address. You get a password. And then it'll take you through a series of about 5 or 6 pages where you can use your clinical justification for using medicinal cannabis. You can check box a New South Wales Health Authority or state authority. It usually says state authority, but in New South Wales, of course, we'd use the New South Wales Health. So you can get an AU number if someone's got a past history of addiction or past history of cannabis use disorder. Remember, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can't have it. It just means that you need to think about they're going to be tolerant, and they're probably not going to want to start on 10 milligrams of CBD a day, and that's probably not going to be very helpful, and it may actually disengage them from treatment. So you might be thinking we'd need to use a THC containing product. Because it's an S8, then you'll need to check box the state approval. It can take up to a week to get that, but usually we get turnarounds on the TGA same day. But I usually tell people it'll be 2 to 7 days. We do the scripts in real time for our patients, and I think that's been my practice. It's not everyone's practice. Some people wait till they get it back. But because I've got a team behind me that do a lot of the work for me, I'll write the script, and we'll write on the TGA approval number on the top of the script once we get it back within 24, 48 hours, up to 7 days when they're working overtime. From there, we see them monthly for the first 3 months, and then after that, we'll see them about every 3 months, unless there's a change in the product that they want to use. Now, it's important to think about the costs of cannabis, and this is part of the informed consent argument that you have to have in any treatment paradigm, that this is going to cost money and it's not going to be rebatable. And I don't think if we look at governments and policies, they've sort of sidestepped the entire PBS argument for medicinal cannabis. They've gone for one product for childhood epilepsy. There's one product, which is a combination oral mucosal spray. I'm doing my best not to mention brands, but we all know what they are. The average cost for using some of the SASB approval type drugs average out to be between $200 to $400 a month. So if you're on a THC style of product, you might be able to get away with spending $200 to $250 a month. If you're using a predominantly CBD-based product, I'd be thinking more $400 to $500 a month. The sorts of side effects of CBD, I'd be looking at things like drowsiness, dry mouth, a little bit of dizziness, orthostatic hypotension. They tend to be transient. And people get used to it. So they may feel a bit drowsy in the daytime if they're taking it in a BD or TDS strategy, but they still get good benefits from sleep at night, and they're not sort of falling asleep at the wheel during the day after a few days. Clearly, the side effect profile with THC goes up, and they can include the side effects of hallucinations and intoxication. They can paranoia, altered level of consciousness, and of course, dependence. Now, it's quite common for patients to come and see me after they've spoken to a pain specialist and they've been told they can't use it outside of a clinical trial, or that they can't use it because it's illegal, or they can't use it because they're going to get hooked on it. It's a difficult conversation to have, because particularly coming from certain craft groups where opioids have been such a mainstay of treatment. And in fact, I can't think of a GABA drug that probably doesn't cause a dependent syndrome either. When I first started going to international conferences as a staff specialist, one of the first posters I stopped at, this is in 2012, was on the abuse potential of gabapentin and analogs, such as pregabalin. That was 9 years ago, and so these are drugs that we commonly use and commonly prescribe, and I don't see that the dependence of those drugs is any less worrisome than the dependence for THC. A recent study in Canada, looking at only 6 months, and I think that's a weakness of the study, showed that although people generally derive increasing benefits over the 6-month period of time on a THC product, that was as a 25 milligram based product of THC, the doses didn't change appreciably over that time. So we didn't see this sort of accumulation of doses, or this notion of hyperalgesia coming in, so that people were sort of caught in the crossfire of tolerance and hyperalgesia and not knowing which way to go with the dose. We need to always, when we're talking to patients, we need to remind them that it's illegal to drive with THC in your system, that it can show up in urine drug screens long after it shows up in the saliva test. So the saliva tests, it'll be out of your saliva somewhere between 6 and 60 hours. There's some good literature on that. Generally speaking, if people are taking CBD dominant with a small amount of THC products, I've started asking them to go and think about buying, street drug test kits from the local chemist and testing themselves after 12 hours, 24 hours, 36 hours. The official line for most cannabis prescribers is somewhere between 3 and 5 days before you can drive. It is a long time. 72 hours is 3 days. Even the most seasoned cannabis user will probably have it out of their system by 70 hours. The question, of course, arises if you have an accident and you get sent off to hospital after you've hurt someone and it shows up in your urine. This is still largely untested legal ground in terms of whether or not people will face, criminal or civil penalties if they've got cannabis in their urine, but they actually stopped using their medicinal cannabis product 3 weeks ago. It's always going to be a hard one, that one. But the onus will be on the prosecution, not on the defence in that situation, to demonstrate that the cannabis had affected capacity. So generally speaking, of course, we want to try and manage a sort of a balance, if you like, between benefits and side effects and costs involved. I think that's, nearly the end of the first part, but I'll just go on to this slide and just talk briefly about some of the challenges that we're looking at in the future. Obviously, depending on dose control, we want to make sure we engage patients. So the start low, go slow process is really good, and it's quite important, particularly with THC. But if we're using the wrong product for the wrong treatment, if we're just giving people low dose CBD for profound problems with chronic pain, we may find that we don't engage patients at all. We do want to reduce pain, but we also want to manage expectations. We want to make sure that people feel like their treatment is helping them, but we also need to show them that there are limits to treatment. And if they're going to stay on low dose CBD because it's too expensive, then they may be actually, better spending their time and money doing something else. And we also need to understand that there's going to be some variations between patients. So I've got big hulking former rugby league players who are 6'4" and weigh 115 kilos, who are on 20 milligrams of CBD twice a day and think it's wonderful. And I've had 94-year-old bedbound people with severe arthritis up and down their spine, every weight-bearing joint in their body, who find 300 milligrams of CBD useless and need a THC CBD combination. With someone of that age, of course, you've got to balance falls risk, you've got to balance renal function, you've got to think about just how much treatment is too much treatment. But if they're in care and if they're supervised, then obviously THC can be very helpful for them. The other challenges are around research evidence. There have been a lot of RCTs and systematic reviews written overseas. When we talk about the evidence of acceptability of cannabis treatments for chronic pain, it hits the moderate level. There's really only 4 levels. There's good, moderate, suboptimal and terrible, and moderate is actually the second best tier. So that's often forgotten in arguments for and against the use of medicinal cannabis. And of course, one of the issues that I strike and I'm partly responsible for is being involved in studies that are largely observational. They're not really the best quality studies for us to be able to tell whether or not we're really making a difference or whether we just think we are. Of course, we've got, every time I see an insurance case, there's refuting position statements by pain specialists and the RACGP and even the RACP, and patients then don't get access to medicinal cannabis treatments for workers' compensation cases, and they have to pay for this themselves. And I'd like to see some sort of, common thread or common thought across the medical specialties to see if we could do research together to come to a common ground about this, whether or not we find the evidence is successful or not. Because if it isn't successful, then we all need to know that, and we all need to stop doing it. That's the scientist in us. We can't just say, oh, I think it's good, so let's all get together and make it good. No, we need to know if it's good, but we need everyone basically trying to work in the same direction to see whether or not there is sufficient evidence to fund treatment, both with workers' compensation or with third party or various other state insurance bodies, as well as potentially the PBS. All right, so that was the end of the first part of the talk. I'm going to stop sharing the screen now and just hand it back to Paul, or hand it through to Nick, but I'll mute now and see if someone else wants to dive in. Nick, did you want to make any comments now? I think you'll have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I'm muting. Yeah, it's probably worthwhile. Maybe if I can perhaps provide a little bit of context, because when we're talking about the role of medicinal cannabis in the treatment of substance use disorders, and I think much of what Mark has presented is sort of is related to some of the more common conditions in which we think about using medicinal cannabis, such as pain, And we know there's so much overlap in our patient populations, that there's so much comorbidity. I think many of our patients, be they prescribed opioids or whether or not they're using cannabis products or other substance use, alcohol, chronic pain is actually quite prevalent in many of the people that present for AOD treatment. So I think one of the things we need to ask ourselves, is there a role of medicinal cannabis in the treatment of comorbidities, such as pain? And there we can draw upon existing evidence and experience and sort of make an assessment there, whether or not, can we use medicinal cannabis to treat PTSD or chronic pain or the myriad of other conditions that people are promoting cannabis products for. But I think if we also then, for sort of an AOD population and community, one of the questions we have to ask ourselves, where do we see the role of medicinal cannabis in our patient populations? And I think it's probably worthwhile sort of identifying that. I think there's sort of three areas that we need to be alert to. The first area is that I think that there are many patients who are going to be prescribed medicinal cannabis, and in particular a THC-based product, who do not necessarily have an AOD background or a substance use disorder history, and that we have to appreciate that a proportion of patients prescribed THC long-term will develop a cannabis use disorder. Our estimates and some of the work that we've been doing puts that at around 10 to 20% of patients prescribed a THC product long-term will develop features of a cannabis use disorder. That's not dissimilar to the proportion of patients prescribed opiates that develop an opiate use disorder. It's the comparable proportion of patients prescribed benzodiazepines. About 10 to 20% develop a benzodiazepine disorder. So I think that's one of the things as an addiction sort of community, we need to be prepared that there will be patients that medicinal cannabis itself is associated with a cannabis use disorder. So that's one thing for us to sort of think about. In the same way, we're often asked to pick up the pieces when we have chronic pain patients with opiates that become dependent, and then they end up in our treatment system for their dependence. So I think we need to be prepared as a sector, increasingly as we see more medicinal cannabis being prescribed, that there will be a population of patients who develop some form of cannabis use disorder. So that's one group. Mark touched upon the issue of opioids and the potential opioid-sparing effects of cannabis. And this is one of the rationales that many people have been promoting medicinal cannabis, that opioids are so harmful, so widely used, associated with so many horrible harms, such as addiction and overdose and all those issues, and that many advocates have been arguing, well, cannabis produces good effects, good outcomes, patient outcomes, and it's not associated with the risks associated with opioids. The evidence for that is still very much yet to be determined. There are lots of sort of survey studies, and we've done some of those ourselves, where you ask patients, since using your medicinal cannabis, what's happened to your opiate dose? And quite high proportions of patients say, I've reduced my opiate dose because of my medicinal cannabis. The research studies, though, the evidence for this in terms of clinical trials and even animal studies actually is still somewhat unclear. So a systematic review that Susie Nielsen was the lead author and a number of us were co-authors on, looked at this issue in some detail. It was published, I think, in 2019. And basically at this point in time, it's still premature for us to say with confidence that cannabinoids are associated with opioid sparing. The strongest evidence is actually epidemiological. And in particular, you look at the jurisdictions in the US where there is widespread availability of medicinal cannabis, compare it to the states where there isn't similar availability of medicinal cannabis. And they've gone and looked at a whole range of population opioid harms, such as overdose rates and so forth. And they've generally been able to demonstrate lower population harms where medicinal cannabis is more widely available. But as we all know, epidemiological data is potentially, it's affected by lots of other confounders that we can't always control for or in our statistical methods. So there may well be a role for opioid sparing with cannabinoids, but at this point in time,
Nick,
the evidence is not strong.
Nick, would you mind if I cut in and ask you a question as a specialist in addiction medicine, seasoned researcher, et cetera, what sort of conditions would you think you might be interested in prescribing a medicinal cannabinoid to treat?
So I'm an addiction medicine specialist, so I won't treat chronic pain. I won't treat PTSD. I don't treat epilepsy because they're not my fields of expertise. I feel confident treating substance use disorder in patients. So in particular then, and this is the third big area, which I think is an important one for us to understand, is also what is the role of medicinal cannabinoids in treating substance use disorders? And very quickly, with alcohol, there's a lot of interest and a lot of promise around the role of CBD, cannabidiol. And Paul and I have been trying to get a study up now for 3 years.
3 years.
3 years. And so there's a lot of interest about CBD for alcohol withdrawal management, but also as a relapse prevention medication. But to date, all we've got is some animal data. We don't have good human data yet. The other area is, can we treat opioid use disorder with cannabinoids? So there's some good animal data about cannabinoids can ameliorate opiate withdrawal. And there's even some emerging human studies where cannabinoids can dampen the severity of opiate withdrawal. But we have no studies looking at longer term cannabinoids as a relapse prevention, for long-term abstinence from opioids. So at this point in time, there may be a role for THC-based medicines to assist with opiate withdrawal. And if we talk to our patients, many patients describe, how in Train Spotting, get some cans of chicken soup and lock yourself up, in a room and with some fluids. So often when you talk to patients, we can often actually learn a lot from our patients. What do you find useful? And many patients for many years have been saying, look, cannabis helps with me coming off methadone or in my opiate withdrawal. So there may well be a role, but we still don't have good studies. There's a lot of interest and excitement around the role of CBD for stimulant use. Some really good animal data was coming through, cocaine in particular, and for methamphetamines, less so, but starting to happen. We've just had a big CBD randomized controlled trial has just been published, looking at CBD versus placebo for cocaine treatment, cocaine dependence, and they found that CBD was not effective at all compared to placebo in either reducing cocaine use nor in reducing cravings for cocaine. So I think we'd have to put the stimulant use on hold until we get some better evidence. And then the big obvious area is cannabis use disorder. So can we use cannabinoids to treat cannabis dependence? And to date, the evidence, most of the evidence is in the role of nabiximols. So that's the THC CBD combination. We've done most of that research here in New South Wales, both looking at nabiximols for cannabis withdrawal effective compared to placebo. And then the big randomized control trial that we published 2 years ago now was looking at Sativex or nabiximols versus placebo in combination with counseling, CBT, over a 12-week period. We found that the nabiximols used less illicit cannabis during the course of treatment. But most importantly, after 12 weeks of treatment with nabiximols and counseling, we then stopped the nabiximols. So we discontinued it after 12 weeks. we followed people up 12 weeks later, and we actually found that that the rates of cannabis, so that the reduced cannabis use persisted 3 months later. So these patients did not all relapse back to cannabis use once we stopped them the biximols. Now, that's what we see with NRT. You know, you can use NRT for 12 weeks, stop it, and then most people don't relapse. But with methadone, you use methadone for 12 weeks, stop it, and everyone relapses. So it's made us think that nabiximols may be more an NRT model than a methadone model. And then the other exciting area is CBD, but all we've got is one pilot study positive, and we're trying to get a randomized controlled trial up through NHMRC at the moment.
So Nick, you're in active clinical practice, and whilst you're a very keen and effective researcher, you are obviously seeing patients day by day that are not eligible for clinical trials. So what do you think the reasonable addiction specialist in the street, inverted commas, should be doing, you know, tomorrow morning with your next patient with a cannabis use disorder?
So I think we're in this challenging situation in Australia, where most of the cannabinoid products we can prescribe are not licensed TGA products. So they're available through special access schemes, and Mark's described the process, and that now is a much smoother process than it used to be. So you can access those products through special access scheme. Now, if you work in a local health district, such as I do, in order to prescribe a medication, you have to have it on your formulary. To get onto your formulary, it's almost impossible to get one of these medicinal cannabis products, not licensed products, onto a hospital formulary. We've tried without success. So in my public sector role, I actually can't prescribe any medicinal cannabinoids outside of a clinical trial because my LHD won't let me. Nabiximols is a licensed pharmaceutical product, but is actually, as Mark pointed out, quite expensive to use it to treat cannabis use disorder. We figured out it works out at around $200 to $300 a week if you're paying over-the-counter prices for nabiximols, and that is actually, many of my patients say that's more expensive than what I spend on cannabis. You know, if you're going through, you know, half an ounce a week, that's $150 to $200, and then the nabiximol is going to cost you more. So there's challenges in the public system. If you work in the private system, though, you can do, obviously, the world is your oyster. And in the private system, yes, I think it is possible. And can I do a plug now? I started doing private practice, and medicinal cannabis is one of the areas that I'm most interested in. And again, you know, and it's been, you know, talking to Mark a lot and getting Mark's experience in this about how to be prescribing medicinal cannabis. I think there's a role both for THC-based products and CBD products in the treatment of cannabis use disorder. I think there's you know, I think what you do is you need to go heavy with the THC early on, as you know, because otherwise patients will get their THC withdrawal, their cannabis withdrawal, and that will lead to relapse. So I think early on you hit them hard with the THC, and then over time the THC can wane off, and that's when you increase your CBD proportions.
Nick, thank you very much. And can I remind the audience to please type in the chat or use the reactions button to put your hand up. But with 108 people logged in, I can't necessarily see all the hands because I've got 7 screens worth of people. So please, it's probably best if you use the chat to type in your questions. So Nick.
Can I add just one other really important point? The one population that we see a lot of working in AOD are people in opioid treatment, methadone buprenorphine programs. anyone who's worked in that setting will be familiar with the just how widespread cannabis use is in our OTP clients. All the estimates suggest it's somewhere around 40% of OTP patients use cannabis fairly regularly. Now, historically, we've always dismissed those patients as, they're just addicted, they're just drug users, that's just what they do. However, when we started looking at why does the general population in Australia use, medical cannabis, and the common reasons are things such as PTSD, pain, sleep problems, and affective problems, mood disorders, anxiety and depression. So that's what the main population is saying. That's why they use medical cannabis. And then we look at our OTP populations and we look at, well, what are the common comorbidities? Pain, depression, anxiety, PTSD, sleep problems. So that's actually got some of us thinking, well, to what extent are these people just addicted to cannabis and that's why they use drugs because they're just, dependent? Or is this actually a self-medication? So are these patients effectively self-medicating their pain, their anxiety, PTSD, and sleep by using cannabis because, if they use benzos, they lose their takeaways. If they use opioids, they lose their takeaways. So cannabis actually may well be an effective and sort of, more acceptable medication. So we've actually got a PhD student who's exploring these issues and looking at, why do our methadone patients use so much cannabis? Because that's the other thing. When you look at all the outcome studies with methadone and buprenorphine, all substance use reduces over time. Alcohol, amphetamines, cocaine, heroin, everything reduces the longer patients stay in treatment, with one exception, and that is cannabis. And cannabis use stays static over time. So I think we need to sort of look at this issue of cannabis use in our OTP populations and just sort of think about what's going on there a little bit more. I think that there is going to be a significant role for us thinking about medicinal cannabis in OTP populations.
Certainly.
That's really.
So you go, Paul. You go.
Oh, no, in fact, I was going to ask Mark if you had any comments or if you had wanted to go to part 2 of your presentation.
Look, we could almost go to questions, but I'll probably put a little bit more up on processes. The thing that Nick was saying is it's certainly exactly what I've seen too. In all the OTP prescribing years that I've had, it's incredibly common to see cannabis come up in people's urines if you're testing for it. And it's usually because people find that it helps them sleep and it regulates their mood. And that's the most common reason why my patients would consider using a cannabinoid while they're on an OTP program. And I think the other point that Nick made about people not wanting to stop, we haven't quite got to the stage yet with my private patients, or the ones that I work at through the clinic that I operate out of. We do a lot of research there, by the way, and we publish research, and we're looking to publish outcomes in all different directions. And one of the ones that I'd like to look at is, well, how many of my patients identified as substance use disorder or cannabis use disorder from the get-go? And my guesstimate so far is that it's around about the same figures that we saw in the CAM study, that it's around about 15 to 20% of patients have a cannabis use disorder from the get-go. And a lot of them don't want to come off medicinal cannabis. As Nick was saying, that they wanted that those numbers stay static. If they come on and they've got an anxiety disorder or a sleep disorder, one of these comorbidities that facilitates a SASB application, then and we put them on a medicinal cannabinoid and they come off, as they usually do, their illicit cannabinoid, then what we find is that they want to just stay on cannabis. As Nick said, those numbers do tend to remain fairly static. A few people will come off, but most of them will stay on. Now, look, I have got some more slides, but I'm trying to temper the slides versus time. We've got a little bit of time left. I might just see if I can jump to another one, if I've got it. Seems to have fallen off my page, which is a really good thing. Oh, no, Sorry, guys, it didn't fall off the page. I found it. I'll see if I can go back up to the top. So it's interesting we talk about addiction. Actually, it's not a bad slide to start on. But I'll see if I can get to that really quickly, and I'll start at slide 1, and then we'll get down to there if I can. Start from the beginning. There we go. Sorry, pressing the same button over and over again and getting the same result. The thing is, we don't have to go through some of these slides already. So we started out with about 5 or 6 indications, and they were in the original guidelines, and everyone who's here tonight probably understands them really well. But this is more.
Mark, it's probably worthwhile pointing out that the TGA actually has no indications. There are no indications. So there's only an indication. An indication happens when a drug company registers a drug for a reason. And none of these unlicensed products have been registered for any indication. So there are a number of areas that the TGA have reviewed the evidence for, but the TGA are also really clear. They will consider an application for anything. If you want to prescribe THC to cure writer's block, you can do that. I mean, they won't accept it, but it's not as though there's only 3 or 4, 5 indications that they're the only things we can use it for.
No, that's true. There are guides around those 5 or 6 things that I talked about, but since then I've seen all manner of different indications come up. One of the things we haven't really discussed tonight is the approved prescriber route. We talked about the SASB. In this bunch of slides, I think I've got a quick slide on how to do this if you weren't going through a SASB through the TGA. And this again, I mean, you could literally write 20 or 30 for each letter of the alphabet. When I did this slide, and the slide is getting old now, there are 72,000 TGA approvals, and I think that number's morphed considerably. 70% of our patients were due to pain. Still, the minority, I think, of cannabis sourced for medicinal purposes was legalized or TGA approved, SASB approved and approved prescriber prescriptions. Most of it was still illicit. So of that, we've seen an increasing prevalence of mental health coming through. I'm seeing more interesting and more novel requests for cannabis use, particularly with things like autism and people who've clearly also got an addiction, but have a mental health comorbidity. I remember from my training that about 30 to 50% of people with an addiction have a mental health comorbidity, and 30 to 50% of people, depending on the study, with a mental health problem have an addiction comorbidity. And so it stands to reason that we're often treating 2 things at once. Some of the really interesting things that are coming out now is that we are seeing cost per milligram of drugs decreasing over time. And we are seeing a proliferation of product. Staying ahead of the number of products is actually one of the hardest parts about doing this. I work in an organization where we have on-site pharmacy, pharmacists, I say. We don't actually have a dispensing pharmacy. And we're able to produce for ourselves large spreadsheets and keep an eye on costs. But there are some websites, BHC CanView, or just CanView, canview.com.au. CanView is a good site. As a doctor, you can register. There's another one, Canna Reviews, with 2 N's, cannareviews.co. And anyone can register for that site. You can get in and you can see all the products and all the prices. And there's an absolute plethora of oils, different types of lozenges, capsules, and inhalables available. Very few of the sort of some of the novel stuff that you see in Holland. We don't have edibles yet, but I think it's probably only a matter of time. So when we look at pathways, I talked to you before that there was about this authorized prescriber pathway. It's a 2-step process. You have to get an ethics approval from your educational college, whether it be the RACP or the RACGP or the College of Psychiatrists, and then you go to the TGA and they produce for you a list of product numbers that you can use, and they actually sometimes do put down reasons that you can use for it, such as, and this depends on the product company or how they're pitched to the TGA. And there's a limit to the dose, particularly with THC, if you go down the approved prescriber route. For instance, with THC products, the limit is 30 milligrams per day. If you've got someone who's got a comorbid addiction, you still should run them through the SASB process. And obviously, if they're under the age of 18, you should run them through the SASB process as well. We tend not to prescribe THC to children. We tend to use CBD at times, and I'll explain some of the interesting areas where this is coming to the fore in a sec or two. I'm going to skip through this slide just to say that there are cannabis receptors everywhere. We know what some of them do. We know what others do. Some things be just a complete mystery about the cannabinoid system, but it's been an active area of research for 40 or 50 years. The Cb1 receptors and THC probably the best researched. CBD is probably more of a negator than anything. It's a partial agonist with mainly antagonistic effects. So it seems to work external to the brain, even though it is lipid soluble. In terms of safety, again, this is away from the addiction side of things and more just in the sort of lethal dose sort of things. It's interesting to think that psychedelics and cannabinoids are pretty low in terms of toxicity when compared to things like GHB, heroin, and even alcohol. All right, we've talked about that one before. Why would you use a medicinal rather than a street cannabinoid? Well, the reason why people use street cannabinoids is because they're cheap, or because they're growing them themselves, or they live in a jurisdiction where it's legal to have them. But the reasons why one might want to use a medicinal would be around the quality issues, around being able to control the ratios. It's amazing when you work with former military personnel who have micromanaged, dropping out of an airplane from 10,000 feet. They like to micromanage their percentage of THC and CBD down to almost the milligram. And so for some people, it really matters how much they're having. For others, of course, they're just looking at the big picture, thankfully, which is that they want to get well or they want to have a better quality of life. Now, in some instances, price is close to parity, particularly with some of the, we talked about nabiximols is a very expensive product. It's about $750 a bottle. And that's a 50-50 blend of THC and CBD. But you can get 50-50 blends up to about 90 milliliters of a SASB type of product. And that will cost you around about $250. And that will last you a month, or last most people a month. And so we're seeing that becomes very, very reasonable. It becomes achievable, if you like, for people who want to use a medicinal cannabinoid rather than a street cannabinoid. And it can be really important for some people because they may be in areas where there's high levels of policing or where they've been busted 2 or 3 times for possession. Doesn't mean they can't have a medicinal cannabinoid. It's always good to write down their forensic history, by the way. I think everything that you write from the get-go is very protective of your decision-making around using medicinal cannabinoids, and can also inform you about, where to step off with people. As Nick was saying, if someone's highly tolerant to THC and you start them on a low-dose CBD product, you're not going to get anywhere with them. There are lots of different delivery methods. These are probably the main 4 that we see prescribed. Oils are probably the most common delivery form. The cannabinoids that we use are oil soluble, and so they don't do well as a dried tablet. Capsules are usually filled with oil or filled with micelles or tiny little capsulettes inside the capsule, which are oil plus the cannabinoid. There's a whole new technology coming around, rapidly dissolving sublingual wafers. They literally like puffballs going off under your tongue. And that's very, very interesting. And this lends us to the arguments around, how can we improve bioavailability? Of course, we already know a terrific way to improve bioavailability, and that's to inhale the stuff. And people inhale THC, they also inhale 50-50 blends of THC and CBD, and there's even some CBD dominant flowers produced. And these are clones that have been engineered to be high producing CBD flowers. Okay, I'm going to skip some of that because I think we've covered it. It's interesting if you look in the mental health side of things, that as Nick was saying, anxiety, PTSD, mood disorders, sleep disorders are very common amongst our OTP population. They're very common amongst our alcohol use disorder population and benzo use disorder population as well. And cannabinoids show great promise there. I'll come back to childhood indications if I get a chance shortly. So we've talked already a little bit about this. We go through a medical assessment, and then from there we think about what sort of treatment we're going to do. There's an example of a SASB application approval. And the idea with dosing in step 4 there is to look at trying to get a dose which produces a clinical effect without having too many side effects. Now, it's not always possible, but it's interesting by titrating doses up from a low dose, particularly with THC, and just stepping through doses. People often tell you when they start to feel the THC types of effects, and whether those effects are clinically bothersome enough for them to back off on their dose. There was going to be a quick second stop, but I'm going to just race through here. The justification, as Nick pointed out, isn't a simple indication. It has to be a chronic condition. It has to have a medical name. It can't just be writer's block, as Nick said. There has to be some sort of previous treatment, and it doesn't necessarily have to all be opioids, or it doesn't have to be a medication. It could be a physical treatment like physical therapy or psychotherapy, and it doesn't all have to be surgical treatments either. So we talked about addiction. I think I'm probably going over old ground here, but there are things where we could look at cannabis straight up, things like cannabis dependence, tobacco, food, alcohol. CBD might be more useful with food than THC. THC is probably not going to be helpful for food addictions because it's going to give you the munchies, but CBD might in fact decrease your appetite slightly. And there are some addictions, as Nick pointed out, for which this is still a little bit uncertain. And the way these sorts of things work, of course, and this has been demonstrated by studies that, as Nick himself's done, is that there is some significant reductions within the biximols. And as he said, that the SUD abatement remains evident well beyond the treatment phase. And as he said, that's probably due largely to it having a more NRT type of effect than an OTP type of effect. But if we move beyond it, I'm just going to quickly finish off the slide deck with a couple of other interesting areas of study. And then I'm probably going to leave about 20 slides at the end that I'm just not going to talk about at all. There's been some interesting, encouraging evidence in autism for CBD. And again, this steps outside of the addiction medicine specialist pure realm, but a lot of addiction medicine specialists are specialists in other areas. And I've come from a general practice background, so I see kids with autism. I haven't seen too many kids lately with Fragile X, but I used to see them. And I know that there's been some studies with Fragile X using a transdermal form of CBD. Now, normally CBD is incredibly poorly absorbed transdermally because of the pharmacokinetics. But there are some interesting matrices being produced which allow improved transdermal uptake up to about 18 to 20%. And so this is actually a really significant outcome because it allows you to treat kids that can't swallow or who refuse to take medication. And certainly across the board with these three groups, that's something that we will see from time to time. There are areas, for instance, within the Fragile X group, which is, it's still too early to say whether this is going to be helpful, but because they're such a helpless group of people, that it's actually a really important study. We talk about doing studies on things where there's a million other treatments. Nick and I were talking last night, we can talk on and on about, using CBD for anxiety, but there's 100 treatments for anxiety. But how many treatments are there really for kids with autism or Fragile X? And the answer is good treatments are far few and far between. And so, this is an area of really interesting promise. Seeing improvements in things like deliberate self-harm, improvements in sleep and anxiety amongst the autism group. But there's unfortunately still insufficient power to point in one direction, definitely with autism. With ADHD, the systematic reviews are still insufficient evidence, but there is some pointing towards a direction in hyperactivity and impulsivity. If we move on to dementia, the Canadians have probably led the world in studies with dementia, and they've used mainly synthetic cannabinoids to do the studies. Of course, if we look at systematic literature reviews, the first thing they say is they need more RCTs. But there is statistically significant improvement in mental state examination, and the synthetic cannabinoid used in this study was incredibly well tolerated with only mild adverse effects. Improvements included things like appetite, sleep, decreased pain, and decreased neuro psychiatric symptoms. We look to the future. We're obviously, we've only got 2 cannabinoids that we're currently playing with in the Australian market, but there's got to be more out there. And there certainly is. In the next slide, I can go through some of them. There are some costs and shortcomings with phytocannabinoids, and they are expensive to produce. They are getting cheaper to produce. But I guess as time goes by, we're going to explore new and novel agents. I'm going to get Nick to talk a little bit about this because I think he's probably got some comment on this. But one of the most important things that we need to be mindful of is if we transition away from these 2 cannabinoids, we need to ensure that there's good quality control moving forward. There's a slide on some of them. Please don't write them all down. If people want copies of some of this stuff later, they can. We need to look at ways to improve bioavailability. We're only getting a little bit along in this direction. We need to go a lot further with this. The oral bioavailability is quite low. It's quite interesting. People experiencing, miracle cures, this sort of flight to health on, 0.1 or 0.2 of a mil of CBD. It may not be anything more than a placebo effect given the oral bioavailability. Looking at ways to bypass first-pass metabolism, such as transdermal preparations, is really, really helpful. Obviously, the smokers have already worked it out. If you vaporize or inhale a cannabinoid, you've got far superior bioavailability to anything else. Yeah, we've got, since I wrote this slide, I think I'm now getting TGA application 42,000 and something or other. We've got now 2 registered products. When I wrote this slide, there was 1. There's this huge plethora of products out in the market. We don't know which one to prescribe. And whether or not prescribing something with 12 milligram per mil of THC versus 10 when married with 10 milligrams of CBD really matters. It can be very, very difficult. We've gone through the first half of this year getting a lot of our inhalational products from the USA and from Canada. And a lot of these things don't come in boats. They come on the back of commercial jetliners. And commercial travel in Australia or into Australia has dropped by 90%. And so there's been huge product shortages with inhalational products, making it very difficult to keep up because every time you have to do a change of product, you have to go back through the TGA and get approval for it. And there are very few inhalational products that you can get an approved prescriber for. In fact, there's only 1 or 2. Most of them you have to get a SASB. And that can take time, and then you have to write the scripts. It's even worse if if you have to do this for a veteran, because then you have to get DVA approval if you want DVA funding for it. And DVA does fund it with approval from a treating specialist in the field of expertise, usually a pain specialist or a rehab specialist. Now, I've said along the way that pain specialists in general sit with this position statement of opposing medicinal cannabinoids, but it's quite interesting when you engage pain specialists one-on-one that a lot of them are prescribing cannabinoids. And if you can pick out the ones that do prescribe them, and you get an approval letter from them for your cannabinoid prescribing for a military veteran, then you will get DVA approval for those patients as well. Okay, look, over to Nick. I think we've pretty much covered the sorts of things that I was going to talk about in this little slide section. So I'll stop sharing and hand over.
Thank you very much, Mark. We do have a few minutes for further discussion or questions. There are a couple of things in the chat, but Nick, Was I interrupting you? Did you want to make a comment?
No, I've been answering chat questions, some really great questions coming through. For those of you who haven't been looking at it, some issues around CBD and safety and driving and work, and the issues there, there's no concerns around CBD. It will not test positive THC in the urine or saliva sample, so there's no concerns there. The cost keeps coming up. Just to be really clear, a drug can only be on the PBS if it is a registered medicine, and most of the medicinal cannabis products are not registered medicines. So it's not as though there's a conspiracy out there, it's just that there's a process, and the medical cannabis companies really need to, if they want their drugs subsidized, they need to get their medicines registered.
So Nick, there was a question about why that hasn't happened. Of course, it's not for you or me or anyone to decide why private companies do or don't take certain actions. But what's your opinion about why they haven't been?
One of the things is patent control here, and really, you can't really patent THC or CBD for anything. Just about any condition you might think that it's worth using, someone's already documented that. So you can't. There's no IP. There's no sort of patent. So all a company can do is patent a formulation. So they can patent, a topical product or THC with, little bells and whistles attached to it. But the THC, the very next company can come along and basically say, we'll do that too. And basically what we're seeing is we don't really have a pharmaceutical industry here. What we have is a medicinal cannabis company set up. And we've seen this in North America as well. These companies are actually, their target and their focus is to sell lots of medicinal cannabis, not necessarily to do the traditional pharmaceutical route, which is do the research, which takes you around 10 years and around $20 million of clinical trials to establish evidence of safety and efficacy, and then get your product licensed. Now, if one of our Australian medical cannabis companies went down that journey, it won't necessarily give them an edge over all the other medicine. We've ended up in this funny space in Australia, and even worse in North America, where there's some research going in from the medicinal cannabis companies to look at specific indications and to get the evidence up. But that's a really small element of most of the medicinal cannabis companies. They're not putting a lot of money into R&D for clinical indications. And I can't see that changing in a hurry. There's only one pharmaceutical company that has done the work, and they're the makers of, the CBD for childhood in Australia. I won't sort of mention companies or brand names. There's only one company that's really done any of this work in getting THC or CBD licensed in its own right.
I think the other thing is the ubiquity of illicit cannabis. The fact that, if you came out with an antihypertensive that was novel, or some drug for congestive cardiac failure, it's not like you can grow it on a tree, chop it up, put it in a vaporizer and smoke it, or get it from behind the pub. And that's one of the other differences, is that if you enter into a market with a novel agent that can't be accessed by the public, then it's incredibly easy. It's much easier, I think, to do the research. It is no cheaper. It's still, as Nick said, 10 years and about $20 million to do it. But you're competing against a product where we already know a huge slice of the Australian population are using cannabis from illicit means, and most of our medicinal cannabis patients are probably a drop in the ocean compared to the medicinal cannabis patients we never see, which are those that are currently buying it from illicit sources. And so to be able to do that research is hard.
Although when we've actually done sort of surveys of consumers, there is a very strong preference for oral sort of pharmaceutical style products, rather than people, punching cones. Like not a lot of people really, unless you come from an illicit cannabis background where you've been, using bongs and joints all your life, most people are not interested in that. Like they're really not. And so I think there is a market for a proper product.
Yep. As to follow up what Nick is saying, when we did our, well, it's not finished, but our ongoing trial in chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, the older people are incredibly not interested in the psychoactive effects of cannabis. They want to be relieved of their nausea and vomiting, quite obviously. They don't want to be high. And so that's actually been a study that's hard to recruit to because a lot of people don't want that. But Nick or Mark, there's an interesting question in the chat from John Saunders about the downscheduling of CBD.
Yeah, I was about to type a response to that one.
So first of all, it was scheduled. Firstly, it was scheduled to Schedule 4 a few years ago when there was no product on the market, and then it was downscheduled to Schedule 3.
So the Schedule 3 means an over-the-counter product, but a Schedule 3 still requires a pharmaceutical company to register that product with the TGA. Yeah. So we still don't have any company that's gone and registered a CBD product with the TGA. But the other sort of trick to what the TGA did is they said we will register up to a 50 milligram per day dose, but a company still needs to go and demonstrate evidence of safety and efficacy of a CBD dose of 50 milligrams or less. There are no conditions that you treat with 50 milligrams of CBD or less. So it was sort of one of those sort of look good on paper. I can't see it ever happening. I don't see in Australia that you will be able to buy CBD over the counter at a pharmacy simply because it's sort of like a trick question, like go and show that CBD at 50 milligrams or less works for something. Doesn't. Well, no one knows what it would work at those doses yet, other than a placebo well-being effect. And it still requires a company to go through a TGA licensing process.
Okay, so, guys, I think it's just after 8:30. I'm going to ask our two speakers to answer what I hope the audience will think is a useful, practical question. If you're considering prescribing a medicinal cannabis to a patient with one of the conditions being discussed this evening, what practical steps would you recommend that doctor does? Because I'm thinking of throwing my hands in the air after this discussion. So, and I would ask for both Nick and Mark to prepare a couple of comments about what practical things would you like our clinicians to be doing?
Can I go first and let Mark finish? Because I think Mark's got much more experience than me. First and foremost, you can't do it in the public system particularly effectively unless you set up clinical trials. So you've got to work in private. So that's the first step. Secondly, all that regulatory stuff that Mark was referring to sounds a little bit complicated, but it is an SASB application, and most of us are familiar with that. And once you've done it once or twice, it's not that hard. And the TGA don't even really review it. They just want to make sure the paperwork's in place. So it is possible. It looks complicated and tricky, but it's not really. And overall, guys, if we can prescribe drugs like methadone or some of the antiretrovirals, or if we can prescribe those drugs, THC and CBD are kind of like, remarkably safe and not that complicated. Most of the principles of THC prescribing mimic opiates. Very similar concepts. Start low, go slow, build up, look at tolerance, look at your side effects, titrate dose to clinical effect. If you work in addiction medicine, most of these concepts are pretty straightforward. So it seems as though it's complicated, but it's really, there's a bit of sort of fiddling around with paperwork, but once you sort of have done that once or twice, it all falls into place. And there's certainly nothing complicated in the in the pharmacology or the, you know, the prescribing issues. Understanding the quagmire of products available, as Mark was highlighting, that can do your head in. But, you know, because it's not like we have a registered, you know, you just get your MIMS out and you prescribe the thing in MIMS. So I would advise, get familiar with 1 or 2 companies with 2 or 3 products that they have, and you just stick to those.
Thank you. Mark?
So I think I'd want to mirror some of those comments. I think, but also what I say is I think you don't need a lot of education to start prescribing medicinal cannabis, but you probably should consider enrolling in a course. And these are subsidized by different Royal Colleges. So the RACGP do a course over about a day. And you can do some online courses. It doesn't take a lot of reading to get around it. It's a bit like if you did a methadone prescribing course in the 80s, early 90s. A lot of it was more around the legislative requirements and about the paperwork and making sure that you understood about takeaways, starting doses, registering patients, how to exit patients, how to write a script, how often you should monitor a patient, what sort of things you should look out for, rather than whether or not you need to get your head across 150 different products. And I think that's the first thing. Do some sort of educational pursuit. It doesn't need to be exhaustive. You don't need to spend a long time. If 4 hours of cannabis continuing professional development will get you a long way along the track. I think the second thing is that you need to just use common sense when it comes to taking a history and when it comes to prescribing and when it comes to follow-up. So as Nick said, I'd probably try and familiarize myself with a pure CBD product that I felt confident in. I'd use a product that was a CBD dominant product, maybe have somewhere between 1 and 3 milligrams of THC and 100 milligrams of CBD, and familiarize myself with that product. And I'd familiarize myself with a balanced product. These are all oils, by the way, and maybe a THC dominant product, as I said. So maybe 3 or 4 oils and a couple of flowers that I was comfortable with. A balanced flower, which had some CBD and THC in it, and maybe a THC dominant flower. It's rare, I think you'd need to go much beyond 20%, but I have seen flowers of 30%. And I've seen these new sort of bubble burst type of T55 products coming out on the market, which are very high strength THC. I don't think that's really necessary. I think you probably need to make sure you take a decent history off your patients, and you need to document what you've written down very, very carefully, what you've taken very carefully around addiction. Don't be shy to prescribe to people with previous addiction histories. Just note it and make sure that you check box the state approval and you get the state approval number and you put that on the script when you're writing. It's like writing any other S4 or S8 script, and treat it as if you were writing a script for one of those products, so that you use numbers and words, and that if you've got repeat intervals, you make sure that you're clear on that sort of thing. Check when your SASB is going to expire. Make sure that you just renew it each year if it needs to be renewed. The devil's in the detail, really. It's around follow-up. So you just, with anything, you can prescribe people anything from methadone to antibiotics to medicinal cannabis. But if you don't follow up your patients, I guess that's really where things fall down. And I think you want to see an outcome, whatever the outcome is. If it's about a bad outcome, you want to know about it as soon as possible. If you don't follow up your patients and you're not even hearing about the bad outcomes, then I think you're sort of missing a really important part of the process. So those are probably the main calls. Just a little bit of education, but don't overburden yourself with a 400-page tome on the stuff. Regular top-ups of education. Familiarize yourself with products, with a few products that you can manage. And finally, just make sure that you take a good history and you document it properly and you follow up properly. That's about all I'd say on that.
Thanks, Mark. Someone's actually asked, do you have any good suggestions for CPD program for people to do? You said the college?
Yeah, well, I think the RACGP runs some courses on it. I'm not sure that the RACP is doing that yet. A lot of the product companies...
They never will.
No, unfortunately. A lot of the product companies are doing, have training. There's a whole, once you get into the cannabis side of things, again, I don't want to go through and name names of pharmaceutical companies or or online webinars that you can do it. But if you typed in cannabis webinar into a Google search, you'll get 30 responses literally hitting you and that's enough, I think. Yeah.
Mark, thank you very much. I think we do want to wrap it up. Last comment, Richard has asked me to check with our two speakers to see if they could address any unanswered questions in writing, which we can circulate to all prescribers whose emails we've got a list of all the people that have logged on. Look, I think it's now time for me to close the session. I really want to thank our two speakers for a very, very interesting lockdown, knock 'em down, socket to 'em presentation on medicinal cannabinoids, something that is an evolving and challenging area. We had over 100 people register, which is a world record for us, I think, and a very, very interesting evening. So thank you all.